Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, 1165–1240, is one of the great Sufis of the Middle Ages, whose life and writings are shown nowadays to have deeply penetrated the thought of East and West alike. He was known to the Arabs as Sheikh el-Akbar, the greatest sheikh, and to the Christian West by a direct translation of this title, Dr. Maximus. As Idris Shah writes in the Sufis, the Andalusian Muslim scholar, poet and mystic's role was to create and spread Sufi lore to allow others to discover and make contact with its essence, regardless of their culture or background. One of the most profound metaphysical influences upon both the Muslim and Christian worlds is Ibn al-Arabi, the Sufi, called in Arabic, the greatest master. He was a descendant of Hatim al-Tai, still famous among the Arabs as the most generous man who ever lived, and mentioned in Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat, "Let Hatim Tai cry supper, heed him not." Spain had been an Arab country for more than 400 years when Ibn al-Arabi the Mercian was born in 1164. Among his names is the Andalusian, and he was undoubtedly one of the greatest Spaniards who ever lived. It is commonly believed that there is no greater love poetry than his, nor was there ever a Sufi who so profoundly impressed the Orthodox theologians with the interior meaning of his life and work. His Sufi background, according to biographers, was that his father was in contact with the great Abdul Qadir Jilani, Sultan of the Friends, 1077–1166. Ibn al-Arabi himself is said to have been born as a result of the spiritual influence of Abdul Qadir, who predicted that he would be a person of outstanding gifts. His father was determined to give him the best possible education, something which was offered in Moorish Spain at the time, to a degree almost unparalleled elsewhere. He went to Lisbon, where he studied law and Islamic theology. Next, while still a boy, he went on to Seville, where he learned the Quran and the traditions under the greatest scholars of the time. At Cordoba, he attended the classes of the great Sheikh el-Sharat, and distinguished himself in jurisprudence. During this period, Ibn al-Arabi showed qualities of intellect far beyond those which distinguished his contemporaries, even though they were drawn from the scholastic elite, in whose families such intellectual capacity was proverbial in the Middle Ages. During his adolescence, in spite of the severe discipline of the academic schools, he spent his free time almost entirely with the Sufis, and began to write poetry. He lived in Seville for 3 decades, his poetry and eloquence winning for him a place second to none in the highly cultivated atmosphere of Spain, as well as in Morocco, which was itself a center of cultural life. In some ways, Ibn al-Arabi resembled el-Ghazali, 1058–1111. Like him, he came from a Sufi family, and was to influence Western thought. Again, like him, he was preeminent in Islamic lore. But whereas Ghazali first mastered Islamic scholasticism, found it insufficient, and then turned to Sufism at the height of his greatness, Ibn al-Arabi maintained, through associations and poetry, a continuous contact with the Sufic stream. Ghazali reconciled Sufism with Islam, making the scholastics understand that it was not a heresy, but an inner meaning of religion. Ibn al-Arabi's mission was to create Sufi literature and cause it to be studied in order that people might thus enter into the spirit of Sufism. Discover the Sufis through their being and expression, whatever their cultural background might be. His talents as a great thinker became evident early on in life. While Ibn al-Arabi was a teenager, his father took him to meet his friend, the philosopher Ibn Rushd, also known to Europeans later as Averroes. Years later, Ibn al-Arabi recounted an esoteric conversation in which he explained to the philosopher the limits of rational perception. That meeting was a watershed moment, which consolidated for Ibn al-Arabi the difference between formal and intuitive knowledge. In 1202, Ibn al-Arabi set off on a journey to the eastern lands of Islam, from which he would not return to his homeland. His travels took him to Mecca by way of Egypt and later to Iraq, Anatolia and the Levant. He settled down in Damascus in 1223. There, Ibn al-Arabi accepted and taught disciples and wrote prolifically until his death in 1240. Among his many writings, his major works written in those later years are the monumental Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, the Meccan Revelations, and Fusus al-Hikam, the Bezels of Wisdom. Reviver of the faith. According to Sufi tradition, Ibn al-Arabi's mission was to scatter, Arabic Nashr, NSHR, Sufi lore throughout the contemporary scene, connecting it with the existing traditions of the people. This sense of scatter is perfectly legitimate and in accordance with Sufi thinking. As the Sufic term for scatter, NSHR, was not at the time used publicly, Ibn al-Arabi employed an alternative word for it. He was known in Spain as Ibn Saraka, son of a small saw. Saraka, however, from the root sarq, stands for another word for saw, derived from the NSHR root. The NSHR root, when normally inflected, means publication, spreading, as well as sawing. It also means revivification. Muhyiddin, Ibn al-Arabi's personal name, translates as reviver of faith. Multiplicity of being taken on their own, some of the statements of Ibn al-Arabi are startling. In Bezels of Wisdom, he says that God is never to be seen in an immaterial form. The sight of God in woman is the most perfect of all. Love poetry, as with everything else to the Sufi, is capable of reflecting a complete and coherent experience of divinity, while concurrently fulfilling various other functions. Every Sufi experience is an experience in depth and in qualitative infinity. It is only to the ordinary man or woman that a word has only one meaning, or an experience less than a large number of equally valid, whole significances. This multiplicity of being is something which, although accepted as a contention by non-Sufis, is frequently forgotten by them when they deal with Sufi material. At best, they can generally appreciate that there is an allegory, which means to them just one alternative meaning. To the theologians, committed to a literal acceptance of divine formalism, Ibn al-Arabi bluntly says that angels are the powers hidden in the faculties and organs of man. It is the Sufi's objective to activate these organs. Unmindful of the difference between formulation and experience, Dante, too, took over Ibn al-Arabi's literary work and crystallized it within a currently possible framework. In so doing, he robbed Ibn al-Arabi's message of its Sufic validity and merely left Professor Asen with an embalmed example of what to the modern mind almost amounts to piracy. Raymond Lully, on the contrary, took over literary material from Ibn al-Arabi, but in addition emphasized the importance of the Sufi exercises which are necessary to complete the Sufic experiences. Ibn al-Arabi's deeper faculties. Ibn al-Arabi, who studied under the Spanish woman Sufi Fatima b. Walia, was undoubtedly subject to special psychic states, such as are cultivated by the Sufis. He refers to these on various occasions. Some of his work was written in trance, and its meaning did not become clear to him until some time after its writing down. When he was 37, he visited Ceuta, where the renowned Ibn Sabine, who advised the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick, had his school. There he had a strange vision or dream, which was interpreted by a famous scholar. The sage said, "Immeasurable, if this individual is in Ceuta, it can be none other than the recently arrived young Spaniard." The source of his inspiration was reverie, in which the consciousness was still active. By the exercise of this Sufi faculty, he was able to produce from the innermost mind a contact with supreme reality, the reality which he explained underlay the appearances of the familiar world. His teachings stressed the importance of this exercise of faculties, which are unknown to most people, and consigned to credulous occultism by the many. A person, he said, must control his thoughts in a dream. The training of this alertness will produce awareness of the intermediate dimension. It will produce great benefits for the individual. Everyone should apply himself to the attainment of this ability of such great value. The complexity of Ibn al-Arabi's work. It is quite hopeless to attempt an interpretation of Ibn al-Arabi from a fixed position. His teachings are derived from the inner experiences, then presented within a form which itself has a function. Whereas poetry has a double meaning, and it often has, he intends not only to convey both meanings, but to affirm that both are valid. Where it is expressed in terms used by others before him, it is not intended by him that this should be taken as evidence of outside influence. What he is doing here is to address himself to people in terminology which forms a part of their own cultural background. There are poems of Ibn al-Arabi's which can be read in a shifting sense, the meaning starting in one theme and drifting into another. He has done this deliberately in order to prevent the automatic associative processes from carrying the reader away into ordinary enjoyment, because al-Arabi is a teacher, not an entertainer. For Ibn al-Arabi, as for all Sufis, Muhammad represents the perfected man. At the same time, it is necessary to know what is meant by Muhammad in this context. Ibn al-Arabi is more explicit than most on this point. There are two versions of Muhammad, the man who lived in Mecca and Medina, and the eternal Muhammad. It is this latter one of whom he speaks. This Muhammad is identified with all the prophets, including Jesus. This idea has caused people with a Christian background to claim that Ibn al-Arabi or the Sufis or both were secret Christians. The Sufi claim is that all the individuals who have performed certain functions are in a sense one. This oneness they call in its origin Hakikat al-Muhammadiyya, the reality of Muhammad. He wrote over 350 works, including the Fusus al-Hikam, an exposition of the inner meaning of the wisdom of the prophets in the Judaic, Christian, Islamic line, and the Futuhat al-Makkiyya, a vast encyclopedia of spiritual knowledge which unites and distinguishes the three strands of tradition, reason, and mystical insight. In his Diwan and his Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, he also wrote some of the finest poetry in the Arabic language. These extensive writings provide a beautiful exposition of the unity of being, the single and indivisible reality which simultaneously transcends and is manifested in all the images of the world. Ibn Arabi shows how man, in perfection, is the complete image of this reality, and how those who truly know their essential self know God. Firmly rooted in the Quran, his work is universal, accepting that each person has a unique path to the truth, which unites all paths in itself. He has profoundly influenced the development of Islam since his time, as well as significant aspects of the philosophy and literature of the West. His wisdom has much to offer us in the modern world in terms of understanding what it means to be human. If the believer understood the meaning of the saying, "The color of the water is the color of the receptacle," he would admit the validity of all beliefs, and he would recognize God in every form and every object of faith.